Welcome to 5-Minute Fridays, where I try to do 5-minute videos on a single topic thing on a weekly basis. A lot of this information is in the weekly garden planner over on our website. If you're interested in having a 52-week calendar showing you weekly to-dos in the garden. This particular video, we're going to take a gardenia around the garden and show you how it might contrast in the garden. What I like to tell people to do is to go to the garden center, find a plant you're drawn to. So let's say you want an evergreen shrub that is mounding in shape, and you also are attracted to fragrant flowers, and you got a full sun area, then a gardenia might be the perfect thing for you. And that foolproof gardenia would be a great example of that. But, you know, you can put that on the cart. Once you've narrowed down, you know, the type of space you have, the type of sun you have, and what kind of plant you'd really like to highlight in that space, you can put it on the cart and then move it around the garden center and find some things that contrast with it in some way. And I'm standing in this spot right now because this is what I want to highlight in this video. We've got this upright, narrow, gold foliage redbud, Golden Falls redbud. It'll get leaves this big, okay? So we can have kind of leaf size and texture differences, okay? Where we have this little, you know, small leaf loropetalum next to this big giant leaf on this redbud. And then the other thing is, obviously, foliage color can play a big part here in how you contrast plants, right? Because that loropetalum has that purple foliage, and this has that chartreuse foliage. And then down here on this Wheeler's dwarf pittosporum, this would be more typical of a green foliage mounding landscape shrub that we would see lots of, boxwoods, and even that gardenia, this pittosporum and azaleas, and so many things that will have these kind of, you know, kind of green oval leaves on them. And while they're all nice plants, a lot of times if you put 3 or 4 of them together without having some sort of contrasting shape or flower color or foliage color, they really don't stand out again, you know, except for maybe the week or two that they're in flower. So what we're going to do is take this gardenia around real quick and show you how it might contrast with some other things in our garden and what you might look for in a garden center. I don't have to move anywhere for the first comparison. You know, again, this has the typical green foliage that you would see on a lot of low mounding evergreen shrubs. It actually contrasts pretty nicely against this very covered up boxwood that's back here. I'm about to do some pruning on this loropetalum to uncover this boxwood. But there are shades of green, and so I don't want to, this is not a bash on green plants in any way, shape, or form video. I love green, and the shades of green that we can have in our gardens, and some shade gardens where they've really thought through the different shades of green can really contrast well with one another. So this isn't, don't do green on green on green. It's maybe look for a slightly different shade of green that can contrast with, you know, a really rich dark green foliage on that gardenia versus that kind of new, fresh looking lime green, light green boxwood. Then, of course, it contrasts against this Golden Falls redbud. It's just completely, you got foliage size, color, and shape. Right, and the shape of the plant being upright and narrow versus mounding, which is what this ultimately is. And then, of course, although they have a similar leaf shape, that little dwarf barberry, this is a sterile barberry we have here in the garden, really low, flat mounding habit. This one a slightly taller doming habit, and then that foliage color contrasts beautifully against it. So, and then of course the loropetalum, as you can see, has more of the broad weeping habit as opposed to this really tightly, almost manicured shape of this gardenia. Another thing backing up to that green on green thing is the leaf size matters as well. So if you had some sort of laurel that had a really large green leaf, even if it was the same color green as this gardenia, that would be fine. Again, though, it's right plant, right place. And so I know the kind of conditions that this gardenia likes, which is sun or part shade, and kind of well-drained winter soils, because they don't really like to stay wet during the winter months. So combining, we're not only looking for plants that contrast against it in these other ways, but we need something that's similar to it and where it's going to go in our garden to really make it complement one another. We came over here and set it in the middle of this group because I've got this orange rocket barberry back here. And again, the color of that's going to contrast just like that other dwarf one did. But this one grows in a kind of a tall, as it gets taller, it kind of splays out wider at the top. It's really kind of interesting. A grass would achieve this same look, okay, of a, you know, something that comes up and then kind of comes out and then weeps down. So you could use an ornamental grass. They're going to grow in similar places. Ornamental grasses are definitely going to want the sun for the most part, and well-drained winter soils, kind of the perfect combo with that gardenia. The orange rocket barberry will go pretty much anywhere as long as it's getting enough light to keep this color. Of course, we can contrast it against various conifers. So I've got the rounded habit of that dragon prince cryptomeria back here, which will have the same rounded habit as this gardenia, but you can see how the foliage contrast wildly against one another. They would also take similar areas. And then there's this upright Chamaecyparis, this narrow upright false cypress, and it's going to have ultimately an upright narrow habit. So again, if you could put this kind of under your windows, and then put something like this that's kind of tall and narrow, slow growing, soft to the touch in between windows or on the corner of your foundation, that kind of thing. But they would contrast beautifully against one another. And then the really soft texture of that rosemary sitting next to it. You get that blue-green foliage. You get, you know, just completely contrasting foliage. And again, this is another thing that doesn't like winter wet and likes the full sun. They go into the same types of spaces, but then contrast beautifully against one another. Flower colors, obviously another thing we can contrast with, but keep in mind a lot of these things won't actually bloom at the same time. So people, you know, unless you're buying things and they happen to be in bloom at the same time, they're unlikely to bloom at the same time. So that rosemary blooms kind of a purple color in the wintertime, and this blooms white in May, June, and get some residual flowers after that. Most everything matches white anyway, but if you are thinking about flower color, it only matters if the flowers are aligned, right? So interestingly, while I like azaleas and I like this gardenia very much, I don't necessarily put them side by side because this basically has an azalea leaf on it. And that's kind of the point of this video, is if you're going to use both of them, a little distance between them, and then something that has some sort of different habit, foliage color, something that contrasts them and makes each of them kind of stand out and pop on their own. This variegated hydrangea paniculata would be a great example of that. This is one that we can keep kind of down as a shrub like this. It doesn't bloom particularly all that well anyway, but it's really grown for this foliage color. So if you saw something like this, look how many different ways this contrast with this. It's got red stems, variegated foliage, large foliage, and as this one matures, even larger foliage. And the habit of it, this one's going to be more like, you know, 4 to 6 feet, where this is going to be 3 to 4 feet. And so these two things are going to make one another stand out in the garden, okay? Individually, or if I just used all these gardenias, I was just looking for one plant to solve the entire problem, you know, whatever I was trying to plant, then there's no individual in the group at that point. Whereas, you know, planting in this kind of way adds some differentiation. And when you get further and further away from your plants, the more they stand out with these different textures and colors and foliage types and that kind of thing from one another. The more of one thing that you have, the further you get away from it, the more it just blends into a kind of a darkness in the frame as you're looking at it. So just some thoughts on find something that really fits the space that you're growing it in. Because again, it's got to be right plant, right place. If I go and buy 4 plants for deep shade and 4 plants for full sun and come back and they look beautiful together, what's it really going to matter if 4 of them struggle because they have to go in a place they don't really want to go in? So it's about picking plants that have similar needs in the landscape and then figuring out how they differentiate from one another to make each individual stand out in the landscape. Thanks for watching.